In the early days, Claire could have never imagined that Emma, her stepsister, would one day betray her. When her father remarried, Claire was still young enough to hold a simple hope that family meant something sacred, that a home could be a place of unwavering trust and comfort. Her father's new wife was kind, and Emma, her daughter, was pleasant enough at first. There were awkward moments of adjustment, of course, as two separate lives were merged under the same roof, but for the most part, Claire felt at ease. She didn't mind sharing her space with someone new. After all, Emma seemed like a pleasant person, easy to talk to, and she had a smile that made Claire think of sunny days. Emma's appearance in Claire's life was the start of something new, something full of potential. They spent weekends watching movies, sharing school stories, and learning how to live together, all while their parents tried to create a new sense of harmony. At the time, it felt like a new chapter, a chance to blend together, and Claire welcomed it. She didn't feel threatened or uncomfortable. After all, it was easy to believe that family could always evolve in such a way that everyone could get along. It was what people wanted, wasn't it? But in the delicate balance of life, something as fragile as trust could be shattered with a single action. Claire, like anyone who loved deeply, was unsuspecting of the ways betrayal could creep in quietly, like a breeze before a storm. It wasn't sudden or overt, but rather subtle, a feeling, a growing sense of unease that Claire couldn't quite place at first. The first sign of a rift came when Claire, excited by the milestone of buying her first car, told Emma about it. It wasn't just a car, it was a symbol. For Claire, it represented her freedom, the independence she'd worked hard to earn. She'd saved for months, working long hours at a part-time job to make the payments. It was hers, and it meant the world to her. She knew it wasn't just about the shiny exterior or the engine beneath. It was a reflection of her growing ability to stand on her own feet. Emma, for her part, seemed to take a genuine interest. She asked Claire all the right questions about the car, what model it was, where she had bought it, how much it cost. Claire thought Emma was excited for her, perhaps even a little envious, but in that quiet way people are when they wish they had something for themselves. It felt harmless. But as time passed, Claire began to notice that Emma's questions lingered, that she spent just a little too much time admiring the car, her eyes glinting with something Claire couldn't quite identify. As the days wore on, Emma's presence around the car became more frequent. At first, Claire brushed it off. What was the harm in Emma looking at the car? It was a shared space, after all, but it wasn't just looking anymore. Claire began to notice things, small marks on the seats, a slight disarray in the car that she didn't remember. Was it possible Emma had been inside her car? Claire told herself it was nothing, just her mind running away with her. But the seed of doubt had been planted, and then one day it happened. Claire came home from school, eager to get into her car and head to her part-time job. But the car wasn't in its usual place. She looked around the driveway, checked the street outside, but it was gone. It wasn't like Emma to borrow the car without asking. In fact, Claire had always been very clear about how much her car meant to her, how important it was to respect her possessions. For the first time, Claire's heart raced in a way it hadn't before. She dialed Emma's number, but the call went unanswered. She called again, this time her voice shaking. No answer. As the minutes dragged on, panic began to settle in. It wasn't just the car, it was everything the car represented. It was a violation, an invasion. It was the first true test of their relationship, of the bond they had slowly built over the years. Could Claire really trust someone she had once considered family? How could someone she had shared secrets with, laughed with, and spent time with, someone she had welcomed into her life, take something so precious without a word? The truth began to surface. Emma had taken the car without asking, driven it without care, as if it were her own. The betrayal stung deeper than any physical damage could have, for Claire knew that this wasn't just about a car anymore. It was about how Emma had disregarded her, how she had placed her own desires above the respect that was owed. Family, Claire thought bitterly, was supposed to mean something more than this. When Emma finally returned, the damage was clear. The car, the one Claire had worked so hard for, was wrecked. Its once perfect body was crumpled, its headlights shattered, its tires slashed. Emma, standing in the driveway, looked as though she had just woken up from a bad dream, eyes wide, mouth agape. But not a word of apology on her lips, not even the faintest hint of regret. It wasn't an accident, not in the way Emma made it seem. She had taken the car out joyriding, driven recklessly, and in the process, destroyed something that meant the world to Claire. Her father, the one person who could have helped, did not. Instead of offering support, instead of standing by Claire's side, he dismissed the situation. It was just an accident, he said, as if the word accident could somehow erase the breach of trust, the violation. "We'll figure it out," he added, turning to Emma with a reassuring smile, as if she needed comforting. The betrayal cut deep, not only because of the car, but because of her father's response. The very person who should have understood, who should have protected her, chose Emma. Perhaps it was easier to forgive Emma's carelessness, to sweep it under the rug, than to confront the uncomfortable reality of family dynamics. Or perhaps, Claire thought with quiet bitterness, her father simply didn't see her the way he saw Emma. Days turned to weeks, and weeks into months. Claire's trust, once a bright flame, now flickered dimly, and the wound left by Emma's betrayal was slow to heal. But as time passed, Claire realized something: her father's silence and Emma's actions weren't just about a car. They were about a deeper truth, that sometimes the people closest to us can hurt us in ways we don't expect. And sometimes the pain of betrayal is not just in the act itself, but in the realization that those we love may not always have our backs. In the stillness of the passing years, Claire began to learn what it meant to protect herself. She would carry this lesson with her: betrayal could come in many forms, and it could come from the places you least expect. But even in betrayal, there was a quiet wisdom to be found, a reminder that the bonds of family, like anything fragile, must be cared for with caution and understanding. And though she could never forget the sting, Claire began to understand that family, in all its complexity, was not something that could be taken for granted. Trust, once broken, required patience, reflection, and sometimes the painful task of learning to let go. The car, for Claire, was not merely a machine. It was something far more intimate, more personal. It was the manifestation of her independence, the realization of years of hard work and sacrifice. The weight of every shift of the gears, every mile traveled, was wrapped up in her ambition, her determination to stand on her own. It was, in a sense, a piece of her soul, something she had poured so much of herself into, that losing it felt like losing a part of her own identity. But when the day came that Emma, her stepsister, took it without asking and returned it wrecked, when the gleaming surface of the car was replaced by the jagged scars of shattered glass and twisted metal, the loss was not just of the car itself. It was of a trust that had been quietly built between Claire and Emma, a trust that had been fractured in an instant. After the accident, the first thing Claire noticed was the silence. There were no apologies, no remorse, just the faint sound of Emma's footsteps as she walked away from the wreckage, her eyes avoiding Claire's gaze, as if she too knew the weight of what had just been broken. Emma's indifference stung more than the physical damage to the car ever could. Claire stood in the driveway, staring at the twisted frame of her once prized possession, unable to move, unable to say anything. It was a strange kind of paralysis, a deep, hollow silence that consumed her. The car, which had once symbolized all her hopes, now represented the depth of her vulnerability. It was as if she had exposed her heart, only for someone to trample on it without a second thought. Her father's reaction only deepened the wound. Instead of confronting Emma, instead of standing beside Claire, he dismissed the entire situation with a wave of his hand. "It was just an accident," he said, the words falling flat, offering no comfort. He didn't understand. He didn't see the connection between the car and the years of effort Claire had poured into it. He didn't grasp the quiet devastation in Claire's heart. As the days passed, Claire's sorrow began to settle in her chest like a stone. It wasn't just the car, though it was undeniably a loss in itself. It was the feeling of being betrayed by her own family, by Emma, and by the one person who should have understood her pain. The emotional damage wasn't something that could be fixed with an apology, no matter how sincere it might have been. It was deeper than that. The first time Claire drove her car after the accident was a quiet, somber moment. She had to take the car to the repair shop, of course, but she could feel the weight of the loss in every corner of the vehicle. The once smooth ride now felt different, almost foreign, as though the car no longer belonged to her, as if the joy of driving it had been taken from her permanently. The repair shop called after a few days. The news wasn't good. The car could be fixed, but it wouldn't be the same. The frame had been bent out of shape, and some parts were beyond repair. The cost of the repairs was astronomical. Claire knew she couldn't afford it. She would have to dip into her savings, the money she had worked so hard to accumulate. And even after the repairs, the car would never be the same. It would carry the scars of that betrayal forever. The loss was not just of a material possession. It was of a piece of Claire's future. Each scrape, each dent felt like a step backward. It wasn't just about fixing a car. It was about mending her shattered sense of security, her faith in herself, her belief in her family. And for Claire, Those things couldn't be fixed as easily as a broken bumper. In the weeks that followed, Claire withdrew into herself. She stopped speaking about the car, stopped bringing it up in conversations. Instead, she poured her energy into work, into anything that would keep her mind busy. But inside, the wound festered. Her pride, her sense of self-worth had been bruised. She couldn't help but replay the events over and over in her mind, each time growing more upset by the callousness of Emma's actions. How could someone who was supposed to be family do this to her? How could her father, of all people, choose to side with Emma? And yet, despite the emotional turmoil, Claire couldn't stop herself from longing for some kind of justice, for a sense of balance to be restored. It wasn't about vengeance. It was about having the wrong acknowledged. She needed Emma to understand the depth of the hurt she had caused. She needed her to see, not just the car, but everything that had been taken from Claire in that moment. She wanted Emma to feel the emotional weight of her actions, to understand that it wasn't just a reckless mistake. It was a betrayal. Claire's path toward dealing with the loss was slow and deliberate. She didn't shout or lash out. Instead, she focused on something that could not be taken from her, her own resilience. She began to repair herself, piece by piece, though it wasn't easy. She didn't forgive easily. Forgiveness would come, but it wasn't going to be forced. It would need to be earned. Time passed. As months became years, Claire gradually let go of the immediate anger. The memories of that day, Emma's careless laughter, her father's dismissive words, began to soften, like a stone worn smooth by the slow passage of time. But the emotional damage didn't vanish. It remained like a quiet echo in the back of Claire's mind, a reminder that her trust had been broken and her heart had been bruised. One day, Claire found herself reflecting on the situation with a clarity she hadn't felt before. She could see now that Emma's behavior wasn't about her. It wasn't a personal attack, but rather a reflection of Emma's own struggles. Perhaps Emma was seeking attention. Or perhaps she simply didn't understand the value of what she had taken. It didn't make her actions right, but it gave Claire a new perspective. She realized that her attachment to the car, while important, was a representation of something greater. The real healing, Claire realized, would come not from repairing the car, but from repairing herself. When Emma eventually reached out to Claire years later, seeking reconciliation, Claire found herself hesitating. Could she forgive Emma? Could she trust her again? In that moment, Claire realized that true healing would require her to release the grip she had on the past. The car, now a relic of her history, had taught her a valuable lesson. That material possessions, no matter how dear, could be replaced. But the emotional scars, the lessons learned, the understanding gained, that was something no one could take away. So, as Claire considered Emma's offer of reconciliation, she understood that it wasn't just about regaining what was lost. It was about allowing herself to move forward, to let go of the emotional weight she had carried for so long. In doing so, she would find a deeper peace, not just with Emma, but with herself. In every family, there are pillars that hold the structure together. Parents, siblings, extended family. Each plays a part in maintaining balance, guiding decisions, and offering a sense of security. For Claire, her father had always been one of those pillars. He was the man she turned to for advice, the one who would comfort her after a tough day, and the one she trusted to understand when something important had been violated. But after Emma's reckless actions, Claire was forced to confront a hard truth. Even the strongest pillars could crack under pressure, and sometimes the person you expected to protect you is the one who lets you down. Claire had always believed that her father would understand her pain. After all, he was a fair man, or so she had always thought. When Emma had taken the car without permission, wrecking it in the process, Claire assumed her father would see the wrong in Emma's actions. He was the one who had taught her the importance of hard work and respect for others' belongings. Surely, he would understand the gravity of the situation. But instead, her father's response was a sharp, jarring contrast to everything Claire had ever expected from him. He wasn't angry, wasn't concerned, he didn't ask Claire how she felt, didn't inquire about the damage to her car, nor did he consider the trust that had been broken. His only concern was for Emma, his daughter from his second marriage. It was just an accident, he said, as if the entire ordeal could be summed up in those words. We'll figure it out. And just like that, the moment of betrayal that had cut Claire deeply was dismissed, as though her feelings were secondary to Emma's comfort. It wasn't that her father didn't love her. It was that, in that moment, he failed to see her pain, failed to protect her in the way she needed him to. He sided with Emma not out of malice, but out of an overwhelming desire to protect her, to shield her from consequences. He saw Emma as the fragile one, the one who needed gentleness, while Claire, the stronger daughter, could withstand the harsh truth. The way her father responded changed everything for Claire. She had grown up believing that fairness in a family was a given, that everyone would be held accountable for their actions. But now, the notion of fairness seemed like an illusion. How could he not see that Emma had crossed a line? That the car was more than just metal and rubber. For Claire, it wasn't about the physical damage, it was about what the car represented. The years of work, the trust she had extended to Emma, and the hope that her family would stand behind her when it mattered most. Instead, her father chose to look the other way. He chose comfort over justice, appeasement over accountability. In that moment, the pillar that had always supported her seemed to waver and crumble, and Claire was left standing in the rubble, unsure of where to turn next. Time, however, has a way of sharpening perspective. As weeks turned into months, Claire's anger at her father grew, but so did her understanding. She began to see that her father's actions weren't rooted in disregard for her. Rather, they came from a place of fear, a fear that if he punished Emma too harshly, the fragile piece of their blended family might break. He had already seen how difficult the adjustment had been for Emma. He had watched her struggle to find her place in their family, and perhaps, out of love, he was willing to overlook her faults to protect her from feeling rejected. It wasn't fair to Claire, and she knew it. But in a strange way, she also understood it. Families, she realized, weren't built on perfection. They were built on compromise, on understanding the complexities of each person's struggles, and on offering forgiveness when it was most difficult to do so. In this moment, Claire realized that her father's choices weren't necessarily about loving Emma more than her. It was about trying to fix something that, in his eyes, might still be broken. He saw Emma as someone who had suffered in her own way, perhaps more than Claire understood, and he wanted to protect her from further harm. The realization didn't make Claire's pain go away, but it softened it, like a rain that slowly erodes the sharpness of a rock. She knew that her father wasn't perfect, that he was human and had his own limitations. And though his decision to side with Emma had caused her deep hurt, she could also see that it came from a place of compassion. It wasn't the kind of justice she wanted, but it was the kind of peace her father thought his family needed. But Claire, in her own way, would still seek a form of justice. Something for herself. Something that would heal the emotional damage done by her father's inaction. She didn't want to tear down the structure of her family, but she also didn't want to be invisible in it. She wanted to be seen, heard, and understood. Her father may have chosen to protect Emma, but Claire would need to protect herself. The first step in Claire's process of healing wasn't to confront Emma. Not directly, anyway. It wasn't about getting back at her, nor was it about confronting her father's lack of support. The first step was to turn inward, to understand why her father's choice had hurt her so deeply. She realized that it wasn't just about fairness. It was about recognition. She felt invisible in that moment, as if her father's decision to protect Emma had rendered her feelings insignificant. In the months that followed, Claire began to take small, deliberate steps toward finding her own voice in the family. She made decisions that were for her, independent of anyone else's expectations. She started prioritizing her own happiness, her own sense of self-worth. She no longer waited for validation from her father, or Emma, or anyone else. She recognized that, in the end, the only person who could truly protect her was herself. When Emma finally came to Claire, years later, seeking forgiveness, the situation had changed. Claire was no longer the same person she had been in that moment of betrayal. She had grown into someone who understood that revenge, in its truest form, was not about retaliation. It was about self-empowerment. Claire had already healed, already moved forward from the hurt that had once seemed insurmountable. She had learned that justice, in its purest form, wasn't always about making the scales of fairness even. Sometimes, it was about finding peace within yourself and allowing others the room to find their own peace as well. And so, Claire listened to Emma's words, not with bitterness, but with understanding. She knew that Emma had her own journey to walk, and that her father, too, had his own set of challenges to face. But Claire, in the stillness of her own heart, had found something far more valuable than revenge. She had found forgiveness, not for Emma, but for herself. She had learned that authority, in its many forms, might fail her in ways that were beyond her control. But she could still choose to rise above it. The internal struggle that Claire felt in the aftermath of Emma's betrayal was unlike anything she had ever experienced before. It wasn't just a matter of grieving a lost possession. It was about grappling with feelings of betrayal, rejection, and self-doubt. The car, once a symbol of her independence, had become a reflection of the emotional turbulence she now carried with her. It was the physical manifestation of her heartache, a constant reminder of how deeply she had been hurt by someone she had trusted. At first, Claire couldn't even name the feeling inside her. She had spent so much of her life trying to protect herself, to shield her heart from pain, that she didn't recognize the raw wound Emma had left behind. It wasn't just the loss of the car, but the loss of something even more precious, her sense of security. The betrayal had shaken her belief in the reliability of her family, her father's indifference to her pain, adding a layer of isolation that she hadn't anticipated. She realized that she had spent so much time looking outward, searching for justice from others, that she had neglected what was happening inside her. For a long time, Claire's heart was clouded with anger. She couldn't stop herself from replaying the day of the accident. The sound of the car's engine starting up without her permission, the feeling of panic rising in her chest as she searched for her car, the shock and disbelief when she finally saw the damage. Every time she thought about it, her heart would tighten, the old wound reopening with a fresh sting. But it wasn't just anger anymore. Slowly, the anger began to mix with shame, a sense that somehow she had failed herself by trusting too easily, by believing that her family would protect her when she needed them most. It was in this mix of anger and shame that Claire found herself at a crossroads. Part of her wanted to seek revenge, to make Emma feel the way she felt, to inflict a kind of emotional punishment that would match the damage done. But another part of her, the quieter, more introspective part, knew that revenge would never bring her the peace she sought. Instead, it would only prolong the pain, feeding the bitterness that had already begun to take root in her heart. She realized that, in a way, Emma's actions weren't just a betrayal. They were a mirror reflecting the parts of Claire's own heart that she hadn't yet healed. As the days and weeks passed, Claire found herself retreating inward, away from the emotional noise that surrounded her. She spent long hours reflecting on the meaning of forgiveness and whether she was truly capable of letting go of the resentment that had built up inside her. She began to realize that forgiveness wasn't just about excusing someone's actions. It was about freeing herself from the chains of anger and hurt that had begun to bind her. The road to healing was slow and winding. Claire didn't wake up one morning with all her anger gone. It wasn't that simple. She found herself cycling through moments of peace and moments of intense emotional turmoil. One day, she would feel strong and independent again, embracing her own sense of agency. But the next day, the memory of the betrayal would sneak up on her, pulling her into a spiral of frustration and sorrow. In these moments of vulnerability, Claire began to turn to the people who truly understood her, friends who had seen her through the ups and downs of her life, and a few close mentors who had taught her the value of self-reflection. They reminded her that healing didn't require perfection, that she didn't have to get everything right. It was okay to feel angry, it was okay to feel hurt, but it was important to honor those emotions without allowing them to control her. One afternoon, as she sat quietly in a park, Claire began to understand that the hardest part of healing wasn't forgiving Emma, it was forgiving herself. She had blamed herself for the betrayal, questioned her own worth, and wondered if perhaps she had somehow brought it on. But the truth was simpler: she had trusted. And trust was never something to be ashamed of, even when it was broken. It was a strength, not a weakness. The real damage hadn't been done by Emma. It had been done by her own belief that she wasn't worthy of respect, that somehow she had been naive for believing in the goodness of others. This realization was like a soft, quiet light breaking through the clouds. It wasn't dramatic or sudden, but it was enough to shift her perspective. Claire understood now that her healing had to come from within. She could not rely on Emma, or her father, or anyone else to fix what had been broken. She had to rebuild her own sense of worth, piece by piece, as gently as possible. It was a kind of self-repair that didn't involve anger or vengeance, but rather acceptance and compassion for the parts of herself that had been wounded. She started small, journaling her feelings, talking openly with friends about what had happened, and allowing herself to feel sadness without shame. She gave herself permission to grieve, but also to acknowledge her strength. Each day, she took one more step forward, one more moment of acceptance. Months later, Emma reached out. Her voice was tentative, apologetic, and Claire felt a pang of emotion as she heard the sincerity in her stepsister's words. But there was no anger now, no desire for revenge. Instead, Claire listened quietly, the distance of time allowing her to hear Emma's apology without the raw emotions clouding her judgment. Emma spoke of regret, of understanding the pain she had caused, and the realization that her actions had hurt not only Claire but the entire family. For Claire, This moment of reconciliation was not about retribution or even about forgiveness. It was about letting go of the past, freeing herself from the emotional weight that had kept her tethered to those painful memories. Emma's apology was not a magic wand that would erase everything, but it was a necessary step toward closure. As Claire reflected on this moment, she realized something important: healing wasn't a straight line. It wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. It was a journey, a process, a gradual unfolding. And it was a process that Claire had to take on her own terms. In forgiving herself, she had freed herself to move forward, without the bitterness, without the anger, and without the need for revenge. And so, over time, Claire found peace. It wasn't the peace she had originally sought, the kind that would make the past disappear or undo the damage done. It was a deeper peace, one that came from within, one that arose from accepting the imperfections of life and the people in it. She no longer saw the betrayal as a defining moment in her life. Instead, she saw it as a lesson, a difficult but necessary lesson in trust, in self-worth, and in the power of forgiveness. She understood now that revenge wasn't a solution. It was just another form of suffering. Healing, she had learned, wasn't about forcing someone to feel the same hurt they had caused. It was about finding the strength to move forward, to rise above the past, and to reclaim her peace. Forgiveness, Claire learned, was not a simple choice, nor was it a clean one. It was a winding path, sometimes jagged, often uneven, but always leading toward a kind of peace. For months after the incident with the car, Claire wrestled with the idea of forgiveness. She knew deep down that forgiveness was something she needed to consider, not for Emma's sake, but for her own. But every time she thought about letting go of the pain, a voice inside her whispered, "But what if Emma doesn't deserve it?" Forgiveness, Claire realized, had always been painted in a way that made it seem like an act of kindness toward the person who wronged you. It was an act of mercy, a generous gesture to heal the rift between two people. But in the quiet moments of reflection, Claire understood that forgiveness wasn't really about the other person at all. It was about her own soul, her own sense of peace. It was about setting herself free from the anger, the resentment, and the weight of holding on to something that could no longer be changed. The more Claire thought about this, the more she felt torn. Her emotions were a storm, at times calm, at times turbulent. She loved her family. There was no question about that. Her father, though his decision to side with Emma had broken her heart, was still her father, and Emma, despite everything, was her stepsister. They shared a family, even if it was imperfect. And yet, the sense of betrayal lingered like a shadow, following her wherever she went. How could she forgive that? The days passed, and Claire found herself caught in a strange limbo, no longer full of rage, but not quite free from the hurt either. She couldn't move forward. It was as though she were stuck in a moment, her mind circling the same memories, the same pain, never quite letting go. Every time she thought she was ready to forgive, another wave of frustration would wash over her. "I shouldn't have to forgive," she would think. "Why should I let this go when it was her mistake, her recklessness?" She found herself searching for answers in the quiet hours before sleep, wondering if she could truly erase the wound, wondering if it was even possible to forget what had happened. It wasn't just about the car. No, it was about the trust that had been shattered, about the fact that the people she had trusted most had failed her when it mattered most. And forgiving felt like a betrayal in itself, like pretending that the hurt hadn't mattered, when it had. But then, in the stillness, she would recall something her friend had said: forgiveness doesn't mean excusing the behavior. It means letting go of the hold it has on you. And that thought, in its simplicity, unsettled her. Then one evening, months after the accident, something unexpected happened. Claire found herself sitting at her desk, staring at the picture of her family on the shelf. The photo had been taken years ago, before everything became so complicated. It was a picture of the 5 of them together: her father, her mother, Emma herself, and her younger brother. Everyone was smiling, relaxed, in a moment of simple joy. She remembered the day it was taken, the way they had all laughed about the awkward angle, and how the sun was too bright, but no one seemed to mind. As she looked at that picture, Claire felt a pang of longing, not just for the family they had been, but for the version of herself who hadn't yet been hurt by Emma's betrayal, who hadn't yet questioned the fairness of her own family. She remembered how she had trusted, how she had believed in the goodness of the people she loved. And in that moment, she realized that trust was the foundation of all relationships: family, friendship, and even self-relationship. Without it, everything was built on sand. The car wasn't just a possession. It had been a part of her independence, a symbol of her growing into herself. But now, as Claire sat there, Looking at the photo and reflecting on the time that had passed, she realized that forgiveness wasn't about erasing the pain of the past. It was about accepting that the past couldn't be changed, no matter how much she wished it could be. And if she kept holding on to the pain, she would only remain tethered to it. Forgiving didn't mean forgetting. It meant releasing herself from the cycle of resentment that had consumed her for so long. The next time Emma called, Claire was ready. She picked up the phone, her hand trembling slightly as she listened to the quiet, hesitant voice on the other end. Emma, who had been so confident and carefree in the past, sounded vulnerable, almost small. She apologized again for the accident, for taking the car, for all the hurt it had caused. And in that moment, Claire felt something shift inside her, like a door opening, a flood of peace rushing through the crack. Emma's apology wasn't perfect. There were no grand gestures, no dramatic admissions of guilt. But what Emma said, what she truly meant, was clear. She regretted what had happened, and she wanted to make it right. Claire could feel the sincerity in Emma's voice, and she realized that forgiveness was not about perfection. It was about understanding, about accepting the humanity of the person who had wronged you, and recognizing that we all make mistakes. Claire took a deep breath before speaking. "I forgive you, Emma," she said, her voice calm but steady. It wasn't a decision made out of obligation. It was a choice made out of compassion, not for Emma, but for herself. She no longer needed to carry the weight of the past. She didn't need to hold on to the anger, to let it control her every thought and decision. There was silence for a moment on the other end of the line. Emma, perhaps, had not expected that answer, and Claire knew that Emma's own road to understanding had been long. But in that moment, Claire felt the burden of resentment lift from her chest, and she knew that forgiveness had begun to work its quiet magic. But forgiveness didn't stop there. It wasn't just about Emma. It was about Claire, too. It was about forgiving herself for allowing herself to be hurt, for not protecting her own heart sooner, and for believing that her value was tied to the people around her. It was about releasing the notion that she had somehow been wronged in a way that couldn't be healed. Claire understood that forgiveness was not a singular moment, but a journey, a daily practice of reminding herself that her peace wasn't dependent on anyone else's actions. As time passed, Claire found that forgiveness became easier, like a gentle habit of the soul. She no longer felt the pull of resentment when she saw Emma or her father. She no longer felt as though the accident was an event that defined her. It had happened, yes, but it no longer had the power to control her emotions. And the freedom she felt in that was profound. For the first time in months, Claire realized that by forgiving, she had taken her power back. It was not Emma's fault that she had caused harm, but it was Claire's choice whether to let that harm shape her future. She chose to let go. Over the years, as Claire and Emma's relationship slowly mended, Claire would often reflect on that moment of forgiveness. She realized that while it had been difficult, it had been the key to her freedom. Forgiveness had not only healed her emotional wounds, but it had also given her the power to move forward in life without the burden of anger. She no longer needed to seek revenge, because in forgiving she had already reclaimed her peace. After the apology, after the forgiveness, Claire thought the hardest part of her journey was behind her. She assumed that with time, everything would settle into place again, that the relationships in her family would return to a kind of balance, that the painful incident would become a distant memory. But Claire soon realized that healing wasn't a linear path. The aftermath of betrayal, of hurt, lingered in ways she didn't expect. It wasn't the intense, sharp pain anymore, but a quiet, underlying ache that, when touched by the right thought or event, would resurface with surprising force. It was in these quieter moments that Claire began to realize something deeper: forgiveness, no matter how genuine, didn't automatically erase the scars of the past, and it was these scars that would, over time, shape her path forward. For Claire, it wasn't about holding onto anger or resentment anymore, but about breaking free from a cycle that had been running in her family long before Emma had taken her car. In the weeks following Emma's apology, Claire began to reflect on the patterns she had witnessed in her family. She began to recognize something unsettling: her father's tendency to overlook or excuse behavior that hurt others in order to preserve peace, his habit of sweeping issues under the rug rather than confronting them head-on. And Emma, who, in Claire's eyes, had once been the symbol of a carefree, thoughtless person, was not the first to make such reckless choices in the family. In fact, Claire saw that Emma's behavior had been a reflection of a much deeper issue: the unspoken dynamics of their household. Her father's response to Emma's accident, his lack of accountability, his inclination to protect Emma no matter the cost, was not an isolated incident. It was part of a larger pattern in the family, one that Claire had internalized from a young age. It was a pattern that said never rock the boat, always smooth things over, sacrifice your own needs for the sake of keeping peace. Claire had lived with this code her whole life. It was subtle, yet pervasive, and it had led her to a place where, time and time again, she had allowed herself to be overlooked, ignored, or even hurt, simply for the sake of avoiding confrontation. This realization came in waves, gentle, at first, and then with more clarity. Claire began to understand that it wasn't just Emma who had wronged her, but the entire system of expectations they all lived under. In some ways, she had enabled this cycle. She had allowed herself to be the one who took the emotional brunt of every difficult situation, always trying to keep the peace, always excusing others' behavior, always giving more than she received. And when Emma's betrayal had come, it had been the tipping point. The moment when all the resentment, all the unspoken frustration, spilled over. Claire's internal struggle now was no longer just about forgiving Emma, or even about her father's failure to protect her. It was about breaking free from this cycle, this family pattern that told her she had to swallow her feelings, that she had to silently bear the weight of others' mistakes in order to keep everything running smoothly. The question that haunted her was, how could she stop herself from falling into the same traps, from perpetuating this quiet suffering? One evening, as Claire sat at the kitchen table, lost in her thoughts, her father joined her for tea. It was an unexpected but welcome gesture, as they hadn't spent much time together since the incident with the car. Her father looked older than she remembered. His face was lined with years of work and worry, and his eyes were wary. They exchanged pleasantries before falling into a comfortable silence, the kind that often passed between them when words felt unnecessary. Finally, after a long pause, her father spoke. "You've been quiet lately, Claire. Is everything okay?" The question, though simple, carried with it a heaviness that Claire wasn't sure she was ready to confront. But it was the perfect moment, and for the first time in years, Claire decided to break the silence that had always existed between them, between everyone in their family. "Dad," she began, her voice soft yet steady, "I've been thinking a lot about how things have always been between us. And I don't know if we've ever really talked about what happened, what really happened. I think it's time we stopped pretending that everything's fine." Her father looked at her, and for the first time, Claire saw a flicker of vulnerability in his eyes. He set his teacup down slowly, as though he were preparing himself for something difficult. "What do you mean?" he asked quietly. And so, for the next hour, Claire opened up in a way she never had before. She spoke about the way she had felt invisible, about how she had always carried the weight of emotional burdens that weren't hers to carry. She told him how his tendency to excuse Emma's behavior had hurt her, how it had left her feeling unsupported and neglected. And most importantly, she told him that she had spent too many years in silence, avoiding confrontation, bottling up her feelings, believing that keeping the peace was the only way to protect the family. Her father listened quietly, his face growing more somber with each word. When Claire finished, he didn't immediately respond. The silence between them hung heavy, like an old wound that had never been treated. And then, after what seemed like an eternity, he spoke. I never realized how much I had failed you, Claire. I thought I was protecting everyone, but I see now that I was just protecting myself. I didn't want to confront the discomfort, the messiness. I didn't want to hurt anyone, including you." It was in that moment that Claire realized something profound. Her father's actions were born out of fear. Fear of conflict, fear of losing control, fear of the emotional fallout that came with facing hard truths. And while that didn't excuse his behavior, it did help her understand it. He had been a product of the same cycle she had been caught in, one that avoided discomfort at all costs, one that didn't allow space for real conversations or healing. Her father's apology, though simple and perhaps incomplete, was the turning point Claire needed. She now understood that breaking the cycle wasn't just about confronting Emma, or even confronting her father. It was about confronting herself, about choosing to step out of the role she had always played in her family, the role of the silent sufferer, the one who bore the emotional weight for everyone else. She had spent so long trying to keep the peace that she had forgotten that peace wasn't the absence of conflict. It was the ability to face it, to work through it, and to allow space for everyone's emotions, including her own. In the months that followed, Claire began to slowly rebuild her relationship with her father, not through grand gestures or immediate resolution, but through small, steady steps. She began to set boundaries, to express her feelings without guilt or fear, and to demand the respect she had always deserved. She also made a conscious decision to break the cycle of silence in her family, to speak up when something was wrong, to confront the difficult truths that had been ignored for so long. And while things weren't perfect, Claire finally felt empowered. She had broken free from the expectation that keeping the peace meant staying silent. She had chosen to live in a way that honored her feelings, that respected her need for emotional honesty, and that allowed her to create a new kind of peace, one built on understanding, communication, and mutual respect. The days after Claire's heartfelt conversation with her father brought with them an unexpected clarity. The weight of the past, the decades of emotional compromise and silence, slowly began to lift from her shoulders. Yet, it was not a sudden or jarring release. It was a gentle unfurling, a quiet exhale. For the first time in her life, Claire felt as though she were living in the present, no longer bound to the mistakes and betrayals of the past, but also not rushing toward a future dictated by anyone else's expectations. It was a stillness, a quiet power that she had never known before. In the months that followed, Claire found herself rediscovering parts of her personality that had been buried for years, parts of her that had been overshadowed by the need to please, to keep the peace, to avoid conflict. She realized that, in the years spent trying to maintain the delicate balance of family dynamics, she had forgotten who she was outside of those roles. She had defined herself by her family's needs, her father's expectations, Emma's recklessness, her mother's absence. And in doing so, she had lost sight of her own desires, her own dreams. It was as though, in finally forgiving Emma and confronting her father, Claire had given herself permission to look at her own life, not through the lens of family obligation, but as her own person. She began asking herself questions she had never allowed herself to ask before. What do I truly want? What do I need outside of the roles I've been playing? She had spent so many years tending to others, giving her emotional energy to her father, to Emma, to her brother, that she had forgotten how to care for herself. Now, she realized that it was time to reclaim her own life, to make decisions that were rooted in her personal needs, desires, and ambitions. This was her life, and it was hers to shape. The first step in this new journey came quietly, almost imperceptibly. Claire made small changes, ones that felt foreign at first but soon began to feel natural. She started spending more time on her own. She took weekend trips to places she had always wanted to visit but had never had the chance to. She began working on a personal project she had long abandoned, a collection of short stories she had always dreamed of publishing. She no longer asked for permission to pursue her own happiness. She simply took it. At first, her family did not understand. Her father, ever the peacemaker, expressed his concern that she was withdrawing from the family. Emma, perhaps sensing the change, tried to reach out in her usual, somewhat careless way, attempting to rekindle a closeness that Claire wasn't sure she was ready for. But Claire stood firm in her decision, not out of defiance, but because she now knew that her happiness did not have to be negotiated with anyone. She wasn't leaving her family behind. She was simply no longer allowing their unresolved issues to dictate her own life. It was during a trip to a small seaside town, on a weekend retreat she had taken alone, that Claire experienced a moment of profound clarity. She had been sitting on a bench by the beach, watching the waves roll in with a quiet rhythm, when something inside her shifted. She had spent so many years navigating the emotional landscapes of others, constantly tending to their wounds, absorbing their pain, and adjusting her own life to fit their needs, that she had forgotten to simply exist for herself. In that moment, she realized that she had already won her quiet revenge. The world would never offer her a perfect closure, and Emma would never fully understand the weight of her actions. Her father might never fully comprehend the extent of his emotional neglect, but none of that mattered anymore. The true victory, the true freedom, lay in her ability to move forward, unshackled by the past, free from the need for validation or retribution. The most profound realization Claire had was that forgiveness, while healing, was only part of the journey. The real power came from creating a new future, one that was not dictated by past events, by old hurts, or by the emotional weight of others' expectations. In forgiving Emma and her father, Claire had freed herself from a role she had been trapped in for years, the role of the silent, suffering peacemaker. She had stepped out of that mold and, in doing so, had given herself the gift of personal autonomy. In embracing that autonomy, Claire found herself finally able to envision a future that was her own, a future where she could take risks, follow her passions, and build a life based on her own dreams. Rather than the obligations imposed upon her by others, she began to set new goals for herself. Goals that were not about compensating for what had been lost, but about growing toward something new, something entirely of her own design, she returned from her weekend retreat with a renewed sense of purpose. She didn't need Emma or her father's approval to move forward. She didn't need the validation of anyone else to know that she was on the right path. All she needed was her own trust in herself, her own commitment to creating the life she desired. Months turned into years, and Claire's life began to shift in ways she could never have predicted. Her writing flourished, and she eventually found the courage to publish a few of her stories, which received praise from an unexpected but warm community of readers. She took on new projects at work, carving out a name for herself in a field she had once felt too small to belong to. Her relationships with her family, while still imperfect, became more honest and open. She no longer held on to old wounds, and though her father and Emma never fully understood her decision to reclaim her life, they began to see that her happiness was not something to be taken for granted. It was something she had earned. Her relationship with Emma, while never quite as it had been, began to change. There was a softening between them, a quiet acknowledgement that the past, though painful, did not have to dictate their future. Emma, seeing Claire's newfound strength and independence, began to slowly understand the depth of her actions, and though she could never fully repair what had been broken, she began to respect Claire in ways she hadn't before. One evening, as Claire sat in her favorite chair, sipping a cup of tea and looking out at the city skyline, she felt a deep sense of peace. There was no great, dramatic conclusion to her story. No sudden, sweeping victory that would make everything perfect. But that was the beauty of it. Claire had learned that peace wasn't found in dramatic gestures or grand moments of justice. It was found in the quiet, everyday acts of living authentically, of standing in one's own truth without apology. She had finally created the life she had always longed for, one that was free of bitterness and free of the patterns that had once defined her. And that, in itself, was the greatest revenge of all, not living in the shadows of the past, but moving forward into the light of her own future. In the years that followed, Claire continued to live a life of her own making, slowly but steadily carving out a future that was uniquely hers. She didn't need to look over her shoulder, didn't need to dwell on what had been. She had learned that the true essence of freedom lay in her ability to define her own worth, to create her own future, and to live authentically, without fear of judgment or the need for approval. And as she lay in bed at night, content and at peace, she realized that the greatest revenge was not in punishing anyone else. It was in living well. For Claire, that was all the justice she ever needed.